Well, folks, thank you for joining us on Conversations. My guest today is a lady with a great story to tell. It did take my eye. She's a very prolific author. 3 books in 3 years, and they cover all sorts of things, from her growing up in the outback on a cattle station to going to school here in Adelaide, and then deciding to go to Prague and write a book about Prague. Now, why and how, we'll come to it. Tanya Heaslip, welcome to the program. How are you?
Thank you, Graham. Very well.
I don't know where to start. I mean, always intrigued by people who grow up in the outback, and you did. You grew up outside of Alice Springs on a cattle station.
Yes.
That wasn't your first memory, though, was it?
First was the Flinders Ranges, because I was actually born in Orroroo in the mid-north, and my parents were from Orroroo and Carrollton, and myself and my sister and my brother were all born in the Orroroo Hospital, and so I had 4 years, they're younger than me, in the Flinders before we went north.
So what were my mum and dad doing in Orroroo? Were they always off the land?
Yes, Dad came from a long line of starving Irish Heaslips that escaped the potato famine and came out to South Australia. There are Heaslips all through the mid-north, and we're part of that. And my family were probably the Heaslips that went the furthest north to Carrollton, and they had sheep.
So you've just introduced a new aspect to the narrative here, the potato famine in Ireland. That's 1860 or
yes.
thereabouts. Did you know much about the first of the family to come out here?
Yeah, it was drummed into us as kids. Ben of the Rock, there were 2 brothers in Ireland, and they were starving, so one brother stayed on the land, they had cattle, and the other brother came out to Australia, and he was Ben of the Rock. And the property back in County Cavan, Ireland, was known as Ben of the Rock's farm. Yeah. And so Ben of the Rock came out and started here, and so began a long line of Heaslips on the land, sheep and crops.
So the famine was created by that disease that impacted on the potato crop.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of it. I should, because it was drummed into me. I just remember always being told, be grateful for your food and eat up. Don't worry about the children starving in India. What about the Irish starving during the potato famine?
So was it a big family? Was your dad from a big family?
No, he actually was. All his forebears were. They had like 6, 7, 8 children per family. But no, it was Dad and his sister June, and I think it was a relatively small family for those times, and they just grew up in the beautiful Flinders. And you
met your mum?
Yes.
In Orroroo?
Yes.
Is she a girl from Orroroo?
Girl from Orroroo. Her father was a rat of Tobruk.
Oh, really?
And their family had a transport moving business there with wagons going right back. And
Wagons?
Yeah, wagons.
Bullocky wagons.
Yeah, bullock wagons. Yeah. And Dad came down here to PAC when he was 12, and Mum used to go to the railway station and wave him off. So they were childhood sweethearts from age 12.
From 12?
Yeah.
And
I think they just held hands, but it was all very. They never lost contact. I think they were sweethearts all their teenage years.
That's very romantic, really.
Yeah, it is.
Are they still with us?
Very sadly, we lost Dad 2.5 years ago. We still have Mum just. I think when Dad went, I think part of her went too.
So the family must have been reasonably well off to send Dad to school at PAC.
Well, I think it was part of the Heaslip tradition. They would determine their kids would get a good education. So Dad went, and it was just after the Depression years and the war, and things were really, really tough on the land. They were skinning rabbits and selling rabbit skins and anything that they could for food. But his parents sacrificed so that Dad could go to school, and Auntie June, she went to MLC. So they were incredibly privileged for those times, which was also drummed into us in later years.
So what did that PAC education mean for your father, if he was going to come back and be a farmer?
He loved football and cricket. I think he was a terrible student. I don't think he was interested in studies, although luckily for him, he was a natural businessman. But footy and cricket kept him going, and then the family legend is that he could have stayed and played for Norwood, but the land called him back.
Oh, did he? Did he tell you that?
Yeah, but so did our grandfather. So we thought, there might be some schism of truth in that, and we've seen the photographs.
Okay, so you're living in Orroroo, the family makes a big decision to move to Alice Springs or outside of Alice Springs. Did you ever discuss how that decision came about?
Yeah, it came about because Mum was a real adventurous. And when she was 18, she'd read A Town Like Alice by Neville Shute, and she wanted to head north. So after the war, the Mid-North was a very conservative place, really, and people were doing it tough. And she wanted adventure and to fly the coop. So she caught a little DC3, thank you very much, all the way to Alice when she was 18 and ended up as a governess on a cattle station north of Alice, helping kids out there with their correspondence school and School of the Air lessons. And she loved it, the big blue skies, just the space, the freedom, anything goes attitude. And when Dad persuaded her to come back and marry him, the deal was, well, we've got to go back to the territory.
Now I'm intrigued. So this young couple, who are madly in love, but one of them decides to go to Alice Springs. Did she ever talk about, was it just the sense of adventure?
I think she was desperate for adventure, and Dad had to go off shearing to make ends meet when he left school. And so she thought, this is my time. And it was very adventurous for her in those days. People in Orroroo were horrified. They said, it's the outback. You'll never be seen again. It's so dangerous up there. Don't go, Janice. But that was all it took. That made her doubly determined. And so she went.
What year would that have been? Do you know?
Yeah, 1957.
57, wow. Okay. Just trying to think, 57, they were adventurous times. And what would the facilities have been like up there in 1950s? You didn't have solar heating?
No. It was, the facilities then were pretty much like they were when we went there in 65. It was just this raw outback with, they had two-way radio and that was it. There was no other forms of communication. You lived in old homesteads where the dust poured in.
How do they decide what property to buy?
Well, that's another good question, because it was a drought. It was a 10-year drought in Alice Springs, and Mum and Dad, they had 3 children under 4, and they had no money, of course, but they thought, right, this is our chance. So there were properties coming onto the market everywhere because of the drought, and our place, Bond Springs, was tiny and unviable, deemed unviable on its own. It had always been an adjunct, a Kidman adjunct actually, to other properties, and so they bought it because that was the only one they could afford, this tiny one. So they thought, right, we'll live up there and we'll continue to run sheep in the Flinders, and somehow we'll work 2 properties. About they were 26. That's gutsy.
Well, how did it work? How did it work out? You're getting onto this property, which is drought-stricken. 150
old cows, that was all, not even breeders.
You're 4 years old.
I'm 4 years old. My sister 3, my brother 1.
My goodness.
We lived in Swags, and this old homestead was like all the homesteads, just filled with red dust off the Simpson Desert because of the dust storms, because there was no feed. And we'd get up in the morning and you could see where we'd slept by the red all around our bodies on the sheet. So in the end, we slept in Swags on the lawn. There was one lawn, and Mum.
Was there any? Well, it must have been some water. If
there was a little bit of water. We had 3-inch baths that were the 3 kids had to jump in once a day. But Mum saved precious bore water for the lawns.
I can't imagine that. How hard must it have been for your mother with 3 kids?
Oh.
No washing machine, no. And red dust.
Red dust everywhere.
And flies.
Flies. Yeah, so many flies.
Why do you love it so much?
That is such a good question. People say, if it's so tough in the outback, why would you go there in the first place, much less stay? Mum and Dad went because they were pioneers. Mum loved it. And for us kids, in the end, it was all we knew. And we just loved this space. There's something magical about the centre of Australia, the inland desert, the once an inland sea, this enormous sky that just goes on, and at night it's almost smothered in stars. Just space, endless space, hundreds of miles of emptiness, and that sense of wonder of being in the middle of nowhere is quite magical. And as kids, we could just run anywhere. We had complete freedom. It was idyllic.
The homestead was what? Was it? You said it was a small property, but what sort of house was it?
Well, it was a beautiful old house, actually, because it had been built originally by Kidman. It was a big old whitewashed stone homestead and had high ceilings. So it was, as far as that, there was nothing else around, but there's this beautiful old whitewashed homestead in the middle of nowhere, and it was against a creek. So there were some trees still in the creek. And when the rain came, the drought broke 3 years later, the desert just flourishes. And so Mum then had 2 lawns, and the tanks were full and we swam in the creeks.
Tanya Heaslip is my guest, folks. She's written 3 books in 3 years, and we'll talk about them, but I'm still intrigued by the outback of Australia.
Yeah.
The books are called An Alice Girl, Beyond Alice, and Alice to Prague. There's a common theme there. We'll take a break and continue that shortly. My guest today on Conversations is Tanya Heaslip. I'll keep wanting to call you Alice. I want to say Alice Heaslip.
Lots of people do, don't worry.
Her books, An Alice Girl, Beyond Alice, and Alice to Prague. But if you just tuned in, it's a story about a young married couple take their 3 young kids, of which Tanya is one, at 4, and they move to this drought-stricken property just outside of Alice Springs and try to make a go of it. Mm. We heard before the break that the homestead was quite nice, being built by the Kidmans, but the conditions around it arid. So when did Dad start to make a go of it? When you went up there, it was just a few old cows, none suitable for breeding.
Well, Dad, luckily, he hadn't had much. He'd had very good schooling, but he was a very poor scholar, but he had a really smart natural business brain. So as soon as the rains came, he did 2 things. He got cattle out of yards down here in Adelaide, bought cattle, breeders, put them on the train at Maree, and then he and my grandfather sat in this train carriage in about 120 degrees Fahrenheit, as it was back then, took the cattle to Alice, offloaded them, and then drove them to the property north of Alice. So he started with the breeders, and when the next rains came, he got cattle from a cattle station to the west, where he knew that they were there was a big droving trip bringing them into town, and that would be easier on the cattle than the train.
How far from Alice was your property?
So our property was the first one to the north of Alice, so not far as the crow flies. It was about a day trip in and out because of boggy roads and cars breaking down. Today you can get there in 3/4 of an hour.
So how long did it take to drove the cattle, though?
To drove the cattle in from the west, it took them 3 months.
3 months?
Yep.
How old were you when that happened?
I was just probably 5.
Okay.
And the people from the west drove the cattle in, and then Dad and his stockman went out to meet them as they got close to our station, and then they took delivery of 1,000 head.
How
amazing!
I mean, that does appeal to me. The clamps of the overflow, I guess.
Yeah.
It kicks in. But did you ever drove yourself?
Yes, our whole childhood, and in fact, all the books have the theme of us kids living on horseback in the stock camp, but that was our life. The minute we could ride, the minute we were big enough to be put on a horse, we had to learn to ride, and we were into the stock camp, droving cattle, mustering cattle, living out there for weeks on end, little men doing big men's work, because kids were about the only reliable, stable workforce on a property, because stockmen came and went.
Yeah.
They were drifters mostly, but your kids were there. So the old adage was you trained up your kids and they became the core of your stock camp, and then anyone else was a bonus. So we worked and worked.
So the girls waded in as well as the guys?
Absolutely. There was no difference. It was really interesting. I grew up in a world of complete equal opportunity where girls did exactly the same as the boys, were expected to work just as hard, do just as much.
You're so petite, though. Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine taking charge of bulls and cows.
And my sister and brother, the same. We were these tiny little things on these big old bony stock horses galloping around, clinging on for dear life. We had a lot of falls.
Oh, and anyone hurt? Badly hurt?
Oh, yeah. We were all badly hurt at different times. Ended up in hospital a couple of times. I don't think my collarbone's ever been the same, or my spine, but it was just what happened. Then you got better and you got back on the horse.
How big did the property end up being?
It was 700 square miles, which, sounds like a lot, but in territory terms, deemed unviable, because you needed about 2,000 to 3,000 square miles in Central Australia to make a go of it.
So was it all done on horseback?
All done on horseback, and then bit by bit, as the years went on, Dad put in more fencing, and then we had an old Land Rover, and then we got motorbikes, then Toyotas. So as the years progressed, but for most of my childhood, it was horses the odd motorbike and Land Rover. But what Dad did, because he hated wasting time, so he learnt to fly. So he learnt to fly in little Cessna 182 and started mustering cattle. So we kids would be on the ground on horseback, and he'd be in the plane overhead diving and swooping and dropping notes out of the window.
Nice.
And then when we couldn't read his scribbly writing, he'd got a loudhailer stuck on the edge of the plane and called out instructions, cattle behind the hill or over that gully or down the creek. We'd have to try and interpret his yelled instructions through the static, and we'd gallop off after the cattle, hoping we were going in the right direction.
Flying planes can be dangerous, though. Did he have
very dangerous.
Did he have any prangs?
No, he was a brilliant pilot. I was told once by the guy who trained him, who was an ex-World War II pilot, that Dad could have been one of those dam buster pilots. He just lived on the edge of his seat and was a natural.
Oh,
yeah.
gosh.
Mum was constantly terrified, but we kids loved it. There's a Dad in the air swooping and diving and...
So would he fly to Alice Springs or would you fly to Adelaide?
Well, what happened was, because he had the sheep still in the Flinders, we'd fly once a year from Alice down to the Flinders, always at Christmas. We'd have Christmas with the grandparents and do the shearing of the sheep at the same time. So Dad always said it changes as good as a holiday. That Methodist Irish work ethic, we never stopped.
So did he get to enjoy the benefits of his labour? Did the riches come with the success of the stock on the land?
Life on the land is always tough, and you're driven by the seasons, so you can never relax. So he was always looking ahead, always saving, because the minute there was drought, you had to destock. And when you had feed, then you needed to build your breeders up, but you couldn't ever have too many or too. It was always a juggling act. He was a very prudent businessman, so I'd say, as time went on, he probably felt he made a success of it because he was constantly expanding, but always prudent and conservative.
Now, this is going to be difficult to judge by today's standard, but what was your relationship like with the Indigenous Australians, the Aboriginals, who were obviously the natural owners of the land?
That's right.
How was that handled in those days?
Well, I write about this in my second book, An Alice Girl. When we arrived, there were no Aboriginal people on the station. Because of the drought, they'd moved to another 10-year drought. They'd moved to another property where they were all originally born. Some of them had come down to Bond Springs, and then some of them moved into town. And around that time, Dad had come from the Flinders, so he'd never worked with Aboriginal stockmen, but he knew they were the best. So he spent much of the early days scouting around, finding the stockmen that had used to work there and brought them out whenever we had musters, because he knew they were the best and he wanted to give them those opportunities. And as we got rain, a number of the Aboriginal people came back and built up a camp there. So when we were kids, we had this amazing time, for which I feel so grateful. The old ladies taking me and my sister and my little brother out looking for, wild food, wild honey, witchetty grubs. We'd trail along behind them. And that was really magic. In 67 and 68, we had the whole referendum and alcohol became legal as well. And so bit by bit, we lost all the people on the property. They went into town, got caught by the bottle and didn't come back. And it was tragic. And Dad's best stockmen were killed, within 10 years from accidents caused by alcohol. He was grief-stricken by that. So we had this brief but very, from my perspective, incredibly lucky childhood, actually being with Aboriginal people and learning how they walked. And from that, I can walk anywhere in the bush and feel safer than anywhere else in the world.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Totally at home in the bush.
The predicament of our first Australians does concern me as somebody who just observes it from afar. You've seen it in a lot more detail from close up. What's the solution? How do we make it better for our first Australians?
So much money, millions, billions has been poured into Aboriginal communities over the decades, and things have got worse, not better. To the extent there's a solution, it's re-empowering the Aboriginal communities to put back in place as best they can their culture, their rules, to put in place structures for their kids, to make sure their kids also get educated, to get them off the streets, off the grog, off the sniffing, and get rid of the white advisors, which is a very controversial thing to say, but the Territory is filled with white advisors and has been for decades, and many people there doing good work, but we're just not really seeing outcomes. So that's probably a bit controversial to say, but I really believe the solution is back with the Aboriginal communities themselves.
You're probably one of the best positioned people to say that because you've observed it at close hand. Do you go back to Bond Springs?
Yes. And in fact, I now live back in Alice. I've lived all over Australia and all over the world, but in the last 4 years returned to Alice, where I finished the books. And I possibly couldn't have finished them if I hadn't gone back. I think I had to go back and walk on that red soil under that big blue sky.
Tanya Heaslip is my guest, folks. She's an author and a raconteur too, as you can tell. 3 books in 3 years, Beyond Alice, An Alice Girl and Alice in Prague. We'll get to that. I promise you, we'll get to that back after the break. Yes, welcome back to Conversations. My guest today is a bubbly little thing over there. She's on the other side of the desk. Tanya Heaslip is an author, I guess, but she's also trained as a lawyer.
I still work as a lawyer.
If you tuned in, she told the story about her mum and dad going on this adventure, buying this property, a small property, only 700 square miles, outside of Alice Springs, and the hardships of building it up and living out there. Obviously, you talk about loving the life as a person, riding stock and living in the great outdoors. I just think about flies and snakes.
There's a lot of flies. Flies were worse than snakes. We knew how to look out for snakes, but flies. There's a trick. There's a trick, Graham. You get like a bit of mulga off a mulga tree, and you just go whack from side to side to side really slowly as you're going along on your horse. You can only do it if you're walking behind cattle, if you're galloping after cattle. Hopefully you're going too fast for the flies to get you. But that's the trick. That saves you when you're out in the middle of nowhere.
So you're 11 or 12, you've done schooling of the air, I suppose?
Yes, correspondence school out of Adelaide and School of the Air in Alice Springs.
So mum and dad say, no, we're going to make a young lady of you. And they send you to boarding school.
Yes, to prison.
To prison. Methodist Ladies College.
Yes.
That seems so, when you say Methodist, that word that sort of implies Puritanism.
Yes, and it was. This is 1975 and it was definitely, that was the approach of the school.
Really? I've heard you talk about it, but I'd love to hear you describe it again. You come down when you've had all this freedom, but you're constrained by 4 walls and school property. How did you adjust?
It was very, very difficult. I felt like an alien. I felt like I'd gone to another planet and into prison because the contrast was so different and I had no social skills. Bear in mind, I'd grown up in the outback. My sister and brothers were my only companions along with the horses and dogs. Suddenly I'm in a school uniform. I've never been in a classroom before. I didn't know to put my hand up to get the teacher's attention or draw a margin down my exercise book. I didn't know how to do art, never played sport. Riding horses isn't much use. So it was really the girls. I think the borders quickly become your second family.
But was there cruelty there when you couldn't fit in? How cruel were the girls? How cruel were the teachers?
Well, separating the teachers in the school, they were fantastic. The boarding house mistresses, they did not provide pastoral care. I think that's perhaps the highest I can put it. They were there to keep us safe, intact, fed, alive, I suppose. But that was it. And once we went through the doors, our parents had no further say. They controlled our lives. And, from a young girl's perspective from the bush, they were like prison wardens. It was very, very difficult. And someone like me who had no social awareness or social skills was very easy prey for bullies. So there was a lot of difficulty.
And you're small.
I'm so small. I was even smaller then.
So were there tears crying into the pillow?
All of that. I remember the first night particularly, but night after night, I'd look out of this little crack of a window in the dormitory, look for stars, because I thought if I could see some stars, the same stars at home, I'd be able to connect to home, Southern Cross, Milky Way. And I looked out, and of course, this is Green Hill Road and King William Road, lights everywhere. You can't see stars.
That's where Annesley College is now.
And I thought, I'm in a place with no stars. The devastation was overwhelming. I thought, not only have I come to another planet, but there's no stars here. And it just confirmed how far away I was. I'd lost all connection to who I knew, what I knew. It's an indescribable feeling, really.
So what is Mum saying when I guess you're riding home?
Yeah.
Pages splattered with teardrops?
Yeah. It was terrible for Mum. Dad had gone to boarding school. He knew how tough it was, but he knew over all the benefits.
He's a guy. He played footy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Mum had never been to boarding school. She went to leaving, 15 years old, in the Orroo school. And she agreed to it only because there was no alternative in the bush. All bush kids got sent to boarding school.
But you did survive eventually.
Yes.
How?
Yes.
How?
Well, the girls became my sisters, my second family. You know, we banded together and supported each other.
The Borders?
The Borders.
The Borders.
The
Okay.
Borders. Yeah, we were like sisters very quickly. The other thing is my guitar and a little orange typewriter.
Could you play guitar?
Yeah, not very well, but my sister, my brothers and I all played country music sitting around the campfire in the stock camp playing, you know, Slim Dusty and Charlie Pride with the Stockmen. So I had my guitar and I played all these country songs, and Country Roads became our little school anthem of take me home to the place where I belong.
Of course it would.
Yeah, and then a little orange typewriter, and I typed stories about the outback, and all the boarders would sit on the bed. They'd all sit around, and I'd tell them stories of daring do's with mustering cattle, and so that kept my life back there alive in my heart here, and the girls supported that.
So when you went home on term breaks,
Yeah.
did you take friends with you, or did you go to their places?
Yeah, we had 3 holidays a year. We had exits in between, and so most of the boarders were country South Australian kids, so they could go home, and they were very generous, and many of them took me home during exits. 3 times a year we had holidays, and I went back to the territory. Initially, I couldn't even comprehend taking anyone home because I needed to go home and soak up every bit of it myself and be with my family. But towards the end, in the latter years, when I'd adjusted more and got used to having 2 lives really, then lots of boarders and some day bugs came with me.
So, day bugs.
Yeah.
So when you get towards the end of your secondary schooling, was it year 11 and 12 then? Or was
we went to matric.
Leaving a matric. So,
yeah.
So were you a good student by then? Oh, you must have been. You got into law.
Well, that was the other thing that saved me. I should have said that actually, that I was a very bookish child. So unlike my poor siblings who weren't, and they never adjusted to boarding school when they came after me. But I was lucky because I loved school. So the teachers were fantastic and I got a brilliant education. And so I became the first School of the Air student to go to law school.
Wow.
Yeah, and become a lawyer in the territory.
Where did the ambition to become a lawyer come
Well,
from?
no, I wanted to become a foreign correspondent. I wanted to travel the world with my little orange typewriter and type stories about people that I met. But I had a girlfriend at school and she said, don't be ridiculous. You're really good at debates and writing history, and you should do law, because my sister has done law, and if she can do law, anyone can do law.
Really?
And on that very informed basis, I said, oh, all right. And then the teacher said, yeah, no, that's a really good idea. And before I knew it.
Just like that. Adelaide Uni?
Adelaide Uni. Fantastic.
So did you live in at Adelaide Uni?
No. Well, what I did first was I went home. I had a gap year before there were gap years because I was so homesick still. I had to go back for a year. Then I came back and I couldn't go into any of the colleges. Like there was St Mark's and places like that around, but I couldn't go back to an institution. I just could not. So I ended up in share houses, and that was fantastic. That was a hoot. So I had a wonderful time at law school.
By this time you're 17, 18, 19.
Yeah.
When does romance start to kick in? Because that's another distraction, isn't it?
It is a distraction. My very first boyfriend actually was this gorgeous boyfriend in the mid-north when I was at boarding school, and we met during our first year. But then, at law school, I had my first probably big real romance, and life really opened up. There were just so many opportunities then once I sort of got out into the outside world.
Was that too much information to give?
I'm still absolutely best friends with both those gorgeous boys.
But you're married now?
Yeah.
When do you meet your husband?
Oh, well, not for years, because one of the impacts of being institutionalised for me was that I just could not be tied down. And all these gorgeous boys I just had to say no to because I wanted to travel the world. And I was like, no, don't tie me down. So I didn't meet my husband until I was 38 and married at 40.
Oh, well, that's probably the best way to do it.
Well, it was fantastic because then I really lived a lot of life and did a lot of things. And then I was ready.
So you want to go and see the world, but you've written a book about Prague in the Czech Republic.
Yes.
Alice to Prague. So where does the fascination come in for that?
Well, I loved modern European history at school, and I got to Europe for the first time just as the Berlin Wall fell, and I saw it fall, and I got my little bit of rock. It was history changing before its
So that's 1989.
1989, November 9. So standing in the slush and the freezing cold in Berlin, and this East German soldier hacks out a bit of rock for me. And I thought, I'm coming back. I'm coming back as soon as I can get over that wall and see what's on the other side, because now I can. And so it took another 4 years. I had to go back to law and earn some money because I was so broke. But eventually, through a friend, I ended up in Prague. Now, I knew nothing about the Czech Republic. This is 1994, just 4 years.
I'm going to get you to pause there because we've got you to Prague.
Yes.
And we'll take a break, and after the break we'll ask you to tell us about Prague.
Okay.
Okay. And the motivation for writing a book.
Yeah.
I want to call her Alice, living next door to, but it's Tanya. It is Tanya Heaslip, such a bubbly pocket rocket in the studio. Back after the break. Welcome back to Conversations. My guest today has brightened up the studio, there's no doubt about it. Tanya Heaslip is a lawyer and an author. Growing up in outback Australia, comes to Adelaide, goes to boarding school and endures boarding school, thrives and then flourishes, gets a law degree, then has wanderlust, I guess, travels the world and ends up in Prague at some stage. Ends up when the Berlin Wall is being torn down and says, I must go back.
Yes.
So 1989, you're watching the Berlin Wall being torn down.
Yes.
And you must go back. When and how do you go back?
1994, a colleague found a role for me in the Czech Republic, and I jumped. I had no knowledge of what I was jumping into, but I wanted to go, so I just packed up my law job and apologised deeply to my boss.
Who was your boss?
Oh, his name was Mike Dean. He was his father was a footballer, I think.
Jim Dean?
Might have been, in Adelaide.
Yeah. Jimmy Dean, one of the great players.
I think so. I apparently so. And Mike, his son, was my boss in Alice. Yeah.
Oh, so you were practicing law?
I was practicing in Alice, yep.
Alice Springs.
Anyhow, poor Mike, had to apologise sincerely to Mike and then jumped. I ended up teaching English to the Minister of Justice and judges of the High Court.
Well, hang on, how do you get a job like that? So you're in Alice Springs and you say, I'm going to Prague.
Yep.
So you buy a ticket, I guess.
So I buy a ticket. I go first via a country school in a country town called Sedlčany, south of Prague. And I taught English there for 3 months, not knowing anything. I taught the kids Waltzing Matilda on the guitar.
Could you speak the language?
No, I knew nothing. It was ridiculous, Graham. I jumped.
How do you teach English when you can't?
Precisely. They are all such good questions that you think I would have considered before I went. But a friend got me this job because he knew someone there, and I thought, right, it didn't matter. I didn't know the language. I didn't know the culture. I knew, again, it was like, the bad old days, because back into the Czech Republic then, there was only one way to get letters home. Well, that was letters, and they had the odd fax machine. So I went really just with this wanderlust, and it was unbelievably difficult to start with, of course, because I hadn't thought any of these issues through.
And the Eastern European states don't have the facilities or the comforts that the rest of Europe has?
No, I'm stuck in this Panelak, which is the name for these huge, hideous, grey, elephantine, communist-type buildings, and thinking my soul's being shriveled, to death here. It was really, really tough to start with.
But you're made of tough stuff, aren't you?
And I couldn't go back. I'd got there and, it would have been, there was no way I could come back to Australia. It would have been too mortifying having just declared I was going. So I had to make it work, and I ended up having an amazing time with these fantastic kids, and I taught them English through Waltzing Matilda because I thought how useful when they reach the outside world to know words like swag, jumbuck, billabong, etc. So there are a whole group of kids who are now adults in the countryside of the Czech Republic who can speak, Central Australian outback language.
Can you speak Czech now?
Trošku.
A
little.
So then how do you get to meet the Minister for Justice?
Again, I wanted to go to Prague, and I found this gorgeous Czech man that I fell madly in love with, and then I found an advertisement for an English school, and it was just luck. They needed somebody to teach these dignitaries, but they needed a really smart, qualified teacher, and their smart, qualified teacher had left to go on to something else. They didn't have anyone, but they found me who was a lawyer. So they just polished me up and said, you'll do, in you go. And I didn't know how to teach these people at all, but they were amazing. I was there in the the highest echelons of legal and political
Yeah.
Czech dignitaries. And so I had to pretend I knew what I was doing. And so I persuaded them to let me work on all their documents that they had to write up in English. And so all our lessons were about, changing the Czech constitution and human rights, documents. It was extraordinary. Extraordinary.
Wow, and that's all in your book.
All in Alistair Prague.
Alistair Prague. Now, you talk about you feel as though the Czech people, and I never know how to describe, because there's different states and different iterations of Czechoslovakia,
Yes.
Czech Republic, and,
Yes.
and others. So
Yes.
I don't understand that. But you talk about how they've been let down by the West,
Yes.
as well as
Very much.
exploited by the East.
Yes.
Can you explain that a bit more?
I knew nothing about their history when I got there, and I was mortified to learn that at the start of World War II and at the end of World War II, we, the West, sacrificed the Czech Republic, first of all, to Hitler, that was the Chamberlain attempt to appease Hitler, and it failed. We basically handed them over, and Hitler just marched into Czechoslovakia. And then at the end, we, the West, just handed them to Stalin.
So that was at the Yalta Agreement.
Yes,
was it?
that's right.
Okay.
That's right. And I'd studied modern European history, but of course we were the good guys because we write the history. I learned firsthand the suffering these people had gone through because we, the West, had not stood up for them. We just discarded them as part of a package deal.
That was a necessary negotiation about borders, surely, after World War II. The Russians had been an ally.
The Russians had been an ally, and nobody, but a lot of people by then were begging the West not to hand them over because they'd seen what Stalin was already doing in Russia. And the stories of, Russian occupation, they were allies, but the end of the war was very messy on all sides. That's probably the best way you can put it. So there were, dignitaries pleading to the West not to hand them over to Russia, but we did.
So you're working in these high echelons of power in the Czech Republic.
Yes.
For how long do you stay?
2 years. And I would have stayed for the rest of my life if I could have. I loved it. I loved the Czechs, their culture, their music, their architecture. Well, I had a love affair that was not going to survive.
So this guy you fell madly in love with.
Yep. And he was the most gorgeous Czech man. But it wasn't, there were a whole lot of reasons it was never going to survive long term. And also, it was very, very hard. I realised ultimately I could never practice law there because I thought I might be able to. But there was still this great mistrust of the West. And because I couldn't speak the language, I tried, I studied, I went to classes. I got quite good, but not good enough to become a professional. And then bit by bit, sort of the homesickness started creeping in. And I had this realisation that I was incredibly fortunate to be able to practice law here on my own terms back in Australia. And so for a whole multitude of reasons, in the end I came back, but I go back constantly and have many dear friends.
So you go back to Alice Springs?
Yes.
You just returned home?
I returned home for a short time, just enough to pacify poor Mike Dean and work a bit more on his files. And then I went to Western Australia where I worked for 23 years in the mining industry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when did you meet your husband?
Well, on one of my trips back to Prague, I returned via London and he was there and a mutual friend said, come and stay and you're going to fall in love with my flatmate. And that's exactly what happened. And luckily for me, Steve, my husband, was born in Adelaide to an Adelaide father and an English mum. And his father had died when he was very young, so his mum took them back to England. He was raised in England, but he had Australian citizenship and a passport. So he was able to come back
So he followed
eventually.
you.
He followed me back.
You.
I know. Isn't that romantic?
Okay, so you meet Steve.
The gorgeous Steve.
Who swept you off your feet,
Yes.
obviously. And
Yes.
I think you would have done the same to him. I think you would have and you come back
So lovely.
You come back to Alice Springs.
Yes.
And you're compelled to write the book, Alice to Prague.
Yes.
Did you
Well, in fact, then we were actually in Margaret River because Steve was into wine marketing. So we lived in Margaret River and I wrote the book there to start with.
Oh, really? Did you feel as though you had to get it all out?
Yeah,
Was that what
yeah,
was that
I
the
did.
feeling?
I was so passionate about writing the Czech story because when I came back, I didn't know anyone who knew really much about the Czechs and I wanted to write it.
Richard Fidler did, because we interviewed him recently with his biography of Prague.
I know. We share a passion for Prague.
So did you know you were an author? Did you know you could write?
I'd always written as a kid. I loved writing, that little orange typewriter. I typed stories at school, but I never thought I was like a good writer, but I wanted to tell stories. So that's what led I think I'd always wanted to be Enid Blyton when I was a kid. Like, who didn't if you wrote stories? But in the end, it was telling the stories that compelled me to start writing books at an adult age.
So Alice to Prague is published.
Yes.
So and the other ones they're really prequels, aren't they? They're not sequels,
Yes,
they're prequels.
that's right. And it came because it took me 15 years to write Alice to Prague because I was working full time and I just had to write it whenever I had time. It took me that long to polish it, get a publisher. And when I did, the publisher said to me, "You think Central Europe is exotic and interesting, but for most Australians, Central Australia is equally as exotic and interesting. And so you should write about your childhood." So that led to the second book, An Alice Girl.
And then Beyond Alice.
And then Beyond Alice. So once I'd finished An Alice Girl, which ends at age 12 with me going off to boarding school, people started writing to me and saying, "Well, we want to know what happens next. What happened with boarding school?" So I said to the publisher, "I better write about boarding school." And by then, I think she was a bit exhausted. So she said, "Okay." So it ended up being 3 books in 3 years.
So what's next?
What's next? I have this passionate desire to write more about the Czechs. I haven't finished there. Return to Prague. I really want to tell the story of the Czech people who escaped and then look at that question of home and what if you can't go home and where do you belong? And there are some wonderful Czech people here in Adelaide and I've got their stories. I'm an honorary member of the Czech Club out in Brompton.
And you can speak, you can converse with them? Or...
Trošku. A little. Most of my Czech I've forgotten, but when I go back there and start drinking their Pilsner beer, it comes back. Okay. Very easily.
But you never had kids?
No. But I love being an auntie. I'm just the most passionate auntie and I've got the most gorgeous, gorgeous nieces and nephews.
So is Alice Springs going to be home forever?
Well, we've been back there 4 years, having lived in the West for 23 or so, and love being back. I'm a restless soul. I think I'm a bit of a gypsy, having lived in so many places, and my very long-suffering, good-natured husband has traipsed around with me. So who knows, Graham? Who knows?
What is he doing while you're writing?
Well, he was in wine marketing, so now he's in tourism marketing, and we need tourism in the Territory now after the last year.
Well, you're a delight to meet and an absolute delight
Thank you.
to interview, and your books, I'll definitely get into them. Alice to Prague is the first one.
Yes.
And Alice Girl is the second one,
Yes.
about life in the Alice Springs, and
Yes.
Beyond Alice, about what happens after.
That's right,
afterwards.
boarding school and the coming of age years.
Tanya Heaslip, good luck with the books. I hope they go well for you, because your personality demands that they're successful, so all the best.
Thank you so much, Graham.
Tanya Heaslip is my guest, folks, and thank you so much for joining us.